The funeral was everything Richard Sterling expected. Hundreds of mourners, expensive flowers, tears from his wife. What he didn't expect was to hear his eldest son checking stock prices during the eulogy, his daughter planning how to monetize his death for Instagram, and his wife whispering, "I love you," into her phone, to another man. Standing in the back in a disguise, watching his own burial, Richard realized he'd built a billion-dollar empire, but failed at the one thing that mattered. Now, very much alive, he had 1 year to fix it all, or lose his family forever. If you're intrigued by what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story takes twists you won't see coming. And trust me, you don't want to miss what Richard does at the will reading. Let's get into it. The leather chair in Dr. Morrison's office had never felt so cold. Richard Sterling sat rigidly, his hands gripping the armrests, as the oncologist's words echoed in the mahogany-paneled room. 6 months, Mr. Sterling, perhaps 8 if the treatment goes well. I'm truly sorry. Richard stared at the diplomas on the wall, each frame perfectly aligned, each achievement a testament to Dr. Morrison's expertise. If anyone would know, it would be him. 62 years old, and this is how it ended. Not in some dramatic fashion, but in a quiet office on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sound of traffic humming 20 stories below. Are you certain? Richard's voice remained steady, the same tone he used in boardrooms when challenging acquisition proposals. Dr. Morrison nodded, his expression a practiced blend of sympathy and professionalism. The scans are conclusive. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We can begin treatment immediately, but I want you to understand the reality of the situation. Reality. Richard had built Sterling Industries from a small manufacturing plant into a multi-billion-dollar empire by understanding reality better than his competitors. He'd made his fortune by seeing things as they were, not as people wished them to be. And now reality was handing him an expiration date. I understand, doctor. Thank you for your honesty. Richard left the medical building and slid into the back of his Mercedes. His driver, Thomas, glanced in the rearview mirror with concern. Home, sir? Yes, Thomas. Home. As the car merged into traffic, Richard gazed out at the city he'd helped build. 3 of those skyscrapers bore his company's name. He'd donated the funds for the children's hospital they were passing. The university had named their business school after him, and in 6 months none of it would matter. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife, Victoria. Dinner with the Hendersons tonight. Don't forget. Wear the blue suit. No. How was your appointment? No concern. But then again, he hadn't told her it was anything serious. Just a routine checkup, he'd said. Victoria had been too preoccupied with her charity gala planning to ask questions. Another text, this one from his eldest son, Marcus. Need to discuss Q3 projections. The board is getting anxious. Also, I'm going to need an advance on my trust fund. Wedding expenses. Marcus was getting married for the 3rd time, each wedding more extravagant than the last, each marriage shorter than the previous one. A voicemail notification from his daughter, Olivia. Dad, I know you're busy, but I really need to talk about the foundation position we discussed. Rebecca got promoted before me and it's completely unfair. Call me back. His youngest son, James, hadn't contacted him in 3 weeks. Not since their argument about James dropping out of business school to find himself in Southeast Asia on Richard's dime. Richard closed his eyes and leaned back against the seat. 62 years old, 40 years of marriage, 3 children, a fortune that Forbes estimated at $3.2 billion. And sitting in the back of this Mercedes, heading to a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home, Richard Sterling had never felt more alone. That's when the idea first crystallized. Not a fully formed plan, but the seed of one. What if he could see the truth? What if he could know, really know what his family thought of him? Not Richard Sterling, the billionaire, the provider, the name on the letterhead, but him, the man, the father, the husband. By the time Thomas pulled into the circular driveway of the Sterling estate, Richard had made his decision. Richard spent the next 2 weeks meticulously planning. He'd built an empire through careful strategy, and this would require the same precision. He contacted Maxwell Chen, his personal attorney for 30 years, and swore him to absolute secrecy. You want to fake your own death? Maxwell's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. Richard, have you considered the legal ramifications? The psychological impact on your family? The psychological impact of dying is worse, Max. This way, I get to know the truth while I'm still alive to do something about it. And what truth are you hoping to find? Richard stood at the window of Maxwell's corner office, looking down at the ant-sized people scurrying along the sidewalks. I want to know if they'll miss me or if they'll just miss my money. Maxwell was quiet for a long moment. You already know the answer, don't you? That's why you're doing this. I want to be wrong, Max. I want to be proven wrong more than I've ever wanted anything. The plan took shape over multiple meetings. Maxwell would handle the legal framework, ensuring everything was technically above board. They'd stage a car accident, remote location, car would go off a cliff and burn. The body would be too damaged for viewing, requiring a closed casket. DNA evidence would be planted to confirm identification. It would cost a fortune in bribes and favors, but Richard had both in abundance. We'll need someone on the inside at the medical examiner's office, Maxwell noted, scribbling on his legal pad, and you'll need a complete transformation. If you're actually going to attend your own funeral, you can't look anything like yourself. For that, Richard hired Oscar Petrova, a Hollywood special effects artist who'd worked on countless films and owed Richard a favor from years ago when Richard had financed his first studio. Oscar worked out of a discreet location in the Arts District, far from prying eyes. You want to look like a different person, but believable as a distant relative? Oscar circled Richard, examining him from every angle. We can do this. Prosthetics for the nose and chin, colored contacts, different hair system, some subtle padding to change your body shape. When I'm done, your own mother wouldn't recognize you. My mother's been dead for 15 years. Then she definitely won't recognize you. Over 3 sessions, Oscar transformed Richard Sterling into Robert Sutherland, supposedly a distant cousin from Scotland who'd only met the family once, decades ago. The prosthetics changed his nose from aquiline to slightly bulbous, added jowls to his jawline, and created the impression of a softer, less defined face. Colored contacts changed his sharp blue eyes to muddy brown. The gray wig gave him longer, unkempt hair instead of his usual neat trim. Subtle padding around his midsection added 30 pounds to his frame. When Oscar held up the mirror for the final reveal, Richard stared at a stranger. "Perfect," he whispered. The car accident was scheduled for a Friday evening. Richard would allegedly be driving to his cabin upstate, a trip he made frequently enough that no one would question it. The location was chosen carefully: a winding mountain road, a sharp curve, a convenient cliff. The car would be found the next morning by a passing jogger who was actually one of Maxwell's private investigators. The night before, Richard had dinner with his family. He studied them across the table of the formal dining room, trying to memorize details he'd somehow never noticed before. Victoria sat at the opposite end, elegant in a cream-colored dress, more focused on her phone than the Dover sole on her plate. Marcus discussed merger opportunities, barely pausing between bites. Olivia complained about a colleague at work. James's seat was empty, still in Thailand, according to his sparse social media updates. "Are you feeling all right, Richard?" Victoria asked, glancing up from her phone. "You're very quiet." "Just tired? Long week?" "Well, don't forget the Pattersons' anniversary party tomorrow evening. It's black tie." He wouldn't be at the Pattersons' party tomorrow. Tomorrow, Richard Sterling would be dead. "I'll remember," he said softly. That night, he walked through the mansion alone. 23 rooms, most of which he never entered. He paused at the door of what had once been a playroom back when the children were young. Now it was Victoria's yoga studio, pristine and barely used. He remembered Marcus at 6, building elaborate towers with blocks. Olivia at 4, hosting tea parties for her stuffed animals. James at 3, always laughing, always bright-eyed and curious about everything. Where had those children gone? When had they been replaced by these strangers who saw him as an ATM with a heartbeat? Or had he been the one to change them by giving them everything except what they actually needed? At midnight, Richard packed a small bag with essentials and left the estate through the service entrance. Thomas was already waiting with a nondescript sedan, not the Mercedes. Thomas was the only staff member Richard trusted completely, and even then he hadn't told him everything. "You're sure about this, Mr. Sterling?" I'm sure, Thomas. Remember, after tonight, you've never seen me. As far as you know, I drove myself to the cabin yesterday evening. I don't like lying to Mrs. Sterling. You're not lying. You're omitting. There's a difference. Richard clasped the older man's shoulder. You've been with me for 23 years, Thomas. In many ways, you've been more of a family to me than my actual family. I need to know if I'm wrong about that. Thomas's eyes glistened. You're not wrong, sir, but I hope you are. The staging went perfectly. By Saturday afternoon, the news was everywhere. Billionaire Richard Sterling dies in tragic accident. The stock market reacted immediately, Sterling Industries shares dropping 4% in after-hours trading. By evening, news crews were camped outside the estate gates. From his hotel room across town, Richard watched it all unfold on television. He saw Victoria dressed in black, making a brief statement on the front steps. Our family is devastated by this unimaginable loss. Richard was a devoted husband and father. We ask for privacy during this difficult time. She'd gotten her makeup perfect for the cameras. Not a tear in sight, just dignified grief. He wondered if she'd practiced the pose. Marcus appeared on CNBC's evening segment. My father built an incredible legacy. Our focus now is on ensuring Sterling Industries continues to thrive in his memory. He would have wanted that. Already positioning himself as the heir apparent. The body wasn't even cold yet, metaphorically speaking, since there was no actual body. Olivia posted on Instagram a childhood photo of her sitting on Richard's shoulders, both of them laughing at a beach somewhere. The caption read, "My hero, my inspiration, my everything. I can't believe you're gone, Daddy. The heartbroken, forever in my heart." 37,000 likes in 2 hours. She'd always been good at social media marketing. James was unreachable in Thailand. According to the news reports, the family was attempting to contact him about the tragedy. The funeral was scheduled for the following Friday, giving time for arrangements and for distant relatives to travel. Richard spent the week in his hotel room, watching his family on television, reading the obituaries, scrolling through social media tributes from business associates and acquaintances. Richard Sterling was a titan of industry, read one statement from a competitor. His innovative vision changed manufacturing forever. A generous philanthropist whose donations transformed our institution, wrote the university president. A ruthless negotiator but a fair dealer, said a former business partner. But what about a loving husband? A caring father? A good man? Those tributes were notably sparse. Oscar did the final prosthetic application the night before the funeral. As Richard looked at Robert Sutherland in the mirror, he felt the last pieces of his old identity slip away. Tomorrow he would attend his own funeral. Tomorrow he would learn the truth. The Sterling family plot was located in Evergreen Cemetery, a prestigious final resting place where titans of industry lay beneath marble monuments and manicured lawns. Richard, as Robert Sutherland, arrived early, positioning himself at the back of the gathering crowd. The sky was appropriately gray, threatening rain but holding off, as if even the weather was playing its part in the performance. The turnout was impressive. Hundreds of people, business associates, politicians, society figures, employees, and distant relatives. The closed mahogany casket sat beneath a black canopy, surrounded by elaborate flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. Richard watched them arrive. Victoria stepped out of a limousine, perfectly composed in a black Chanel suit and oversized sunglasses. Marcus and his fiancée, Brittany, or was it Bethany, followed. Olivia emerged next, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, her every gesture carefully calibrated for the photographers who'd been allowed to capture tasteful shots from a distance. James had made it back from Thailand, looking disheveled and uncomfortable in an ill-fitting black suit. At least he'd come. That was something. The service began with remarks from Pastor Williams, who'd officiated at countless high society events, but had never actually had a conversation with Richard beyond pleasantries at fundraising dinners. Richard Sterling was a man of vision, Pastor Williams intoned, his voice carrying across the cemetery. A man who built not just buildings, but dreams, who created not just wealth, but opportunities for thousands of employees and their families. Standard eulogy fare. Nothing personal. Nothing that couldn't apply to any successful businessman. Then Marcus stepped forward to deliver the family eulogy. Richard leaned against an oak tree, studying his eldest son's face. "My father." Marcus's voice cracked slightly, and Richard felt a flutter of hope. "My father was an extraordinary man. From humble beginnings, he built an empire. He taught me the value of hard work, of perseverance, of never accepting defeat." Richard waited for something more. A childhood memory, a personal moment, anything that suggested Marcus knew him as more than a business mentor. "He showed me that success isn't given, it's earned, that leadership requires difficult decisions, that in business, as in life, you must always think 3 moves ahead." Marcus paused, looking down at his prepared notes. Sterling Industries was his life's work, and I pledge today that we will honor his memory by taking this company to even greater heights. The quarterly projections— "Excuse me." Olivia's voice cut through the ceremony. She stood abruptly from the front row. "Marcus, this is our father's funeral, not a board meeting." Marcus's jaw tightened. You were simply making sure everyone knows you're in charge now." Olivia's voice rose, losing its carefully modulated grief. "Some of us actually lost a father today, not just a career opportunity." "That's enough," Victoria hissed, her composure cracking. "Both of you, not here." But it was too late. The floodgates had opened. "Don't pretend you're heartbroken, Olivia," Marcus shot back. "You couldn't be bothered to visit him for Sunday dinner more than once a month. You were always too busy with your social calendar. At least I visited. You only showed up when you wanted something. How many times did you ask him to bail out your failed investments?" "My investments are doing fine, unlike your foundation position that Daddy bought for you." "Enough!" Victoria stood, trembling with fury, or maybe embarrassment. Richard couldn't tell from this distance. "Your father deserves better than this. Sit down, both of you. Now." The cemetery had gone deathly quiet. Hundreds of eyes watched the Sterling family implode in real time. Richard could see the guests exchanging glances, some shocked, others, he had to admit, clearly enjoying the drama. Marcus and Olivia sat, but the damage was done. Pastor Williams attempted to recover the ceremony's dignity, but the spell was broken. The rest of the service passed in a blur of awkward hymns and uncomfortable shifting. As mourners filed past the casket to pay their respects, Richard observed from his position at the periphery. Business associates approached with practiced solemnity, touching the casket briefly before moving on, already pulling out their phones to check messages. Society friends offered Victoria air kisses and murmured condolences, their concern clearly performative. But it was what happened after the main crowd dispersed that truly captured Richard's attention. Marcus stood apart from the family, speaking urgently into his phone. Richard edged closer, staying behind a large monument to eavesdrop. "Yes, I understand the situation," Marcus was saying. "But with Father gone, the trust provisions change. I need access to my full inheritance immediately, not in increments. No, I don't care what the will says. Get Maxwell Chen on the phone. As the eldest son and new CEO, I have every right—" "What do you mean there might be complications?" He listened for a moment, his face darkening. "There better not be any surprises in that will. I've earned this. I've put up with Father's controlling nature for 38 years. It's my turn now." Richard's stomach twisted. Put up with? As if being his son had been some kind of burden to endure. Nearby, Olivia was having her own conversation with a group of her friends. "I just can't believe he's actually gone," she was saying, her voice hitching. Then, barely a beat later, her tone changed. "Do you think it's too soon to post on Instagram? I don't want to seem insensitive, but this could really boost my following. People love authenticity during grief." "Definitely wait a few days," one of her friends advised. "But then you could do a whole series. Life lessons from my father or something. Very on brand for you." "That's brilliant. Oh my God, I could even do a podcast about dealing with loss. There's definitely a market for that." They walked away, already planning how to monetize Richard's death. Victoria stood alone near the casket, and for a moment, Richard felt a surge of hope. Maybe his wife of 40 years would show some genuine emotion now that the cameras were gone. He moved closer, careful to maintain his disguise. Victoria's phone rang. She answered immediately, her voice low. "Yes, I'm alone now." No, the service was a disaster. Marcus and Olivia made a scene. I don't know what Richard was thinking with that will structure. Maxwell won't tell me anything until the reading next week. Well, obviously I'm entitled to at least half. We were married for 40 years. I know there's a prenup, but surely that doesn't... What do you mean it's ironclad? She paused, listening, her perfectly made-up face hardening. David, I didn't wait this long to end up with just the house and some stock options. Richard promised me I'd be taken care of. Yes, I know what I said. But that was before. Look, can you just come over tonight? I need you. This has all been so stressful and... Her voice softened. I've missed you. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the chest. David. David Thornton, his former business partner, the man who'd been his best friend for 20 years before a falling out over an acquisition deal 10 years ago. Victoria had insisted they maintain social ties with David and his wife. For networking purposes, she'd said. Apparently, she'd maintained more than social ties. He watched his wife, widow, he corrected himself bitterly, touch up her lipstick using her phone's camera, practiced and precise, before walking toward her waiting car. She didn't look back at the casket. Richard stood frozen, unable to process the cascade of revelations. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? The truth. No illusions, no comfortable lies, just the stark reality of who his family really was when they thought no one was watching. He should leave. The funeral was over, the mourners departing. He'd seen enough to confirm his worst suspicions, but something kept him rooted to the spot, some masochistic need to witness every moment of this train wreck. That's when he noticed James. His youngest son had been standing silently at the edge of the gathering, not speaking to anyone, not checking his phone. As the last mourners filtered toward the parking lot, James approached the casket alone. He stood there for a long moment, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. Then James began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard crept closer, hiding behind a nearby mausoleum. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I ran away. I'm sorry I was such a disappointment." James's voice broke. "I know you wanted me to be like Marcus, to care about the business, to be the son you deserved, but I couldn't do it. Every time I walked into that office, I felt like I was suffocating, like I was playing a role in a play I never auditioned for." Tears streamed down James's face now, making no effort to hide them or wipe them away. "The thing is, I wanted to tell you that. I wanted to explain, but every time I tried, you'd talk about quarterly reports or expansion plans, and I'd realize you didn't actually want to know me. You wanted to know the version of me that fit into your world." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you did care, and I was just too stubborn to see it. And now I'll never know." James pulled something from his pocket, a photograph worn and creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. Richard couldn't see it clearly from his hiding spot, but he knew what it was. He knew because he had the same photograph in his study at home. James at 7 years old, the two of them fishing at the lake cabin. The last time, Richard realized with a jolt that they'd done something together just for fun, with no agenda, no business discussion, no disappointed lectures about James's lack of ambition. "I kept this," James said softly, placing the photograph on top of the casket. "Because that day, I felt like you actually saw me, not as your successor or your legacy, but just as your kid. I know I let you down after that. I know I wasn't what you needed me to be, but God, Dad, I really loved you. I really, really did." James pressed his hand against the casket, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the photograph behind. Richard felt something wet on his face and realized he was crying. For the first time in decades, perhaps since his own father's funeral, Richard Sterling was crying. Not the controlled, socially acceptable moisture in the eyes that appeared at appropriate moments. Real, ugly, broken crying. James loved him. Past tense, loved. As in, no longer. As in, Richard had killed that love through years of criticism and distance and treating his sensitive, creative youngest son like a defective version of Marcus. An elderly woman's voice startled him out of his spiral. "Are you all right, dear?" Richard spun around, suddenly remembering he was supposed to be Robert Sutherland, distant cousin. He wiped his eyes quickly. Yes, sorry, Richard and I weren't close, but family is family, you know? The woman nodded sympathetically. She was in her 70s, dressed in a simple black dress, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Were you family? I don't believe we've met. Robert Sutherland, distant cousin from Scotland. We met once, years ago. Ah, I'm Martha Green. I was Richard's executive assistant for 35 years until I retired 5 years ago. Richard remembered her well. Martha had been the engine that kept his office running smoothly, anticipating his needs before he knew he had them. He'd given her a generous retirement package and a gold watch, standard procedure for valued employees. He must have been a good man to work for, Richard said, fishing for information. Martha's smile was complicated. He was exacting, demanding. He expected excellence and didn't tolerate excuses. But he was also fair. He paid well. And underneath all that gruff exterior, she paused, looking toward the casket. I think he was lonely, especially toward the end. Lonely, but he had everything. Family, success, wealth. Having everything and having what you need are very different things, Mr. Sutherland. Martha's gaze was piercing, and for a terrifying moment, Richard thought she'd seen through his disguise. Richard worked 18-hour days for decades. He built an empire, but empires are cold places to live. I used to see him sometimes, late at night when everyone else had gone home, just sitting in his office staring at old photographs. I think he wondered where it all went wrong. Did he ever talk about his family? Not often. But I remember once, maybe 10 years ago, his youngest son came by the office. James, I think. Such a sweet boy, but you could tell he was uncomfortable in that world. Richard tried to show him around, explain the business, and James just looked more and more miserable. After he left, Richard said to me, I don't know how to talk to him, Martha. He might as well be from another planet. What did you say? I told him that maybe he should stop trying to teach James about business and just ask him about his life. Ask about his interests, his dreams, his fears. Be a father, not a CEO. Martha sighed. He said I was right. He said he'd try. But I don't think he ever did. Richard Sterling was brilliant at many things, but vulnerability wasn't one of them. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the caretakers begin to dismantle the funeral setup. If you'll excuse me, Martha said gently, I have one more goodbye to say. She walked to the casket and placed her hand on it, much as James had done. Thank you for the opportunity, Richard. Thank you for trusting me with your professional life, even if you couldn't trust anyone with your personal one. I hope you've found peace. Then she walked away, and Richard was alone with his own casket. The sky finally made good on its threat, releasing a light rain that seemed almost scripted in its timing. Richard approached the casket slowly, his hand trembling as he touched the polished mahogany. This was it. This was how the world would remember Richard Sterling. A funeral attended by hundreds who barely knew him, eulogized by a son who saw him as a career stepping stone, mourned by a daughter who saw him as content for her social media, grieved by a wife who was already planning her next chapter with another man, and one son, one genuine mourner who'd loved him and lost him long before this staged death. Richard picked up the photograph James had left behind. The edges were soft from handling, the colors slightly faded. He remembered that day with perfect clarity now. James had caught his first fish, a tiny sunfish that they'd thrown back. But James had been so proud, so excited, and Richard had felt something he rarely experienced, pure, uncomplicated joy. When had he stopped chasing that feeling? When had success become more important than happiness? When had the empire become more real than the people it was supposed to benefit? Mr. Sutherland? Richard turned to find Maxwell Chen approaching with an umbrella, appearing seemingly from nowhere. His old friend and attorney had been watching from a distance, as planned. How are you holding up? Maxwell asked quietly. I've attended more pleasant funerals. Did you find what you were looking for? Richard looked back at the casket, at the photograph in his hand, at the empty cemetery where his family had gathered and then scattered like leaves in wind. I found exactly what I was afraid of, Richard said, and one thing I didn't expect. James? James. Richard's voice was thick. Max, I've made terrible mistakes. Yes, you have. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Richard watched the caretakers begin to lower the empty casket into the ground. A burial of illusions, he thought. The death of Richard Sterling, the invincible titan. Maybe that version of him deserved to stay buried. I'm going to attend my will reading, Richard said finally, as Robert Sutherland, distant cousin and surprise beneficiary, and then I'm going to burn my old life to the ground and build something that actually matters. Maxwell allowed himself a small smile. That's the most sensible thing you've said in 40 years. They walked together toward the parking lot, leaving Richard Sterling in his grave, ready to haunt his own legacy. The will reading was scheduled for the following Wednesday at Maxwell Chen's law offices downtown. Richard, still in his Robert Sutherland disguise, arrived early and was shown to a private office adjacent to the main conference room. You'll be able to hear everything through the speaker system, Maxwell explained, adjusting the hidden camera angles that would let Richard observe without being seen. When I call you in, you'll enter as Robert Sutherland. Just stick to the script we prepared. And you're certain the will is structured the way we discussed? I've had 48 hours to make adjustments based on what you observed at the funeral. It's perfect, or perfectly destructive, depending on one's perspective. Maxwell's expression was grim. Richard, are you absolutely sure about this? Once we execute this plan, there's no going back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. At 2 p.m. sharp, the Sterling family assembled in the conference room. Richard watched through the camera feed as they took their seats around the massive table. Victoria sat at one end, composed and elegant in a black dress with a single strand of pearls. Marcus sat to her right, his posture radiating confidence and entitlement. Olivia sat to Victoria's left, checking her phone. James slouched in a chair at the far end, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Also present were Victoria's sister Catherine, Richard's brother Harold, whom he barely spoke to, and several other distant relatives who'd emerged from the woodwork once news of the death spread. Richard recognized a third cousin he'd met exactly once, at another funeral 20 years ago. Maxwell entered carrying the leather portfolio that contained the will. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time, and I'll do my best to make this as straightforward as possible. Just tell us what we're getting. Maxwell, Marcus said impatiently. We all know how this works. Maxwell's expression didn't change. Mr. Sterling's will is quite detailed. We'll go through it section by section. But first, I need to inform you that there is a beneficiary present who is also a witness to these proceedings, Mr. Robert Sutherland, if you would join us. Richard took a deep breath, made sure his prosthetics were secure, and entered the room. Every eye turned to him. Who the hell is Robert Sutherland? Marcus demanded. I'm a distant cousin, Richard said, affecting a slight Scottish accent that Oscar had helped him practice. From the Edinburgh branch of the family, Richard and I met many years ago. I don't remember Father ever mentioning you, Olivia said suspiciously. No, I don't suppose he would have. We weren't close, but apparently he remembered me. Richard took a seat at the opposite end of the table from James, giving himself the best view of everyone's reactions. Can we please just get on with this? Victoria said irritably. I have an appointment at 4. Maxwell opened the portfolio. Very well, let's begin. I, Richard Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, superseding all previous versions. Standard opening. Everyone looked bored already. Marcus was already calculating numbers in his head, Richard could tell. Olivia had her phone in her lap, probably ready to post about this immediately after. First, regarding Sterling Industries, Maxwell continued, I hereby establish the Sterling Industries Trust, which will hold controlling interest in the company. Management of this trust will be overseen by a board of 3 trustees, Maxwell Chen, Martha Green, and James Sterling. The room exploded. What? Marcus was on his feet. James doesn't know the first thing about running the company. He dropped out of business school. The decision stands, Maxwell said calmly. The trust will control 51% of Sterling Industries stock. The remaining shares are distributed as follows. Marcus Sterling receives 15%, Olivia Sterling receives 15%, Victoria Sterling receives 10%, and the remaining 9% is divided among various charitable organizations. This is insane, Marcus sputtered. Father would never. This will must be invalid. James isn't even qualified to. I'm qualified to be a trustee, James said quietly, speaking for the first time. Everyone turned to stare at him. I may not be qualified to be CEO, but I can help make decisions about the company's direction. Maybe bring some balance to the profit at all costs mentality. Balance? Marcus's voice was venomous. You mean destroy everything Father built? No. James met his brother's glare steadily. I mean, remember that a company is made of people, not just profit margins. Something you've forgotten. Richard felt a surge of pride watching James stand up to his older brother. When had the man, developed this backbone? Maxwell cleared his throat. If we could continue. Regarding the Sterling estate and properties, the main residence will be held in trust for Victoria Sterling until her death or remarriage, at which point it will be donated to the Children's Hospital Foundation and converted into a recovery facility for young patients. Victoria went pale. Remarriage? What does that have to do with? It's a standard clause, Maxwell said smoothly. Shall I continue? The lake cabin will go to James Sterling, as it was the location of our happiest memories together. James's eyes widened, and Richard saw tears threatening to spill over. The photograph. James had mentioned the fishing trip in his graveside confession. Somehow, Richard had incorporated that memory into the will. My art collection will be divided equally among my 3 children, with the exception of the Monet water lilies, which will go to Martha Green, who appreciated them every day she came to work. The Monet is worth $6 million, Olivia protested. My personal effects, Maxwell continued, ignoring her, including my watches, cufflinks, and other items, will be auctioned with proceeds going to the Sterling Scholarship Fund, which will provide full university scholarships to students pursuing degrees in the arts and humanities, preferably those who feel pressured by their families to choose more practical paths. James let out a choked laugh that was half sob. Richard was speaking to him directly through this will, acknowledging the pressure he'd put on his youngest son, the dreams he'd dismissed. Now, regarding liquid assets and investment portfolios. Maxwell paused for effect. This is where things get interesting. I have observed throughout my life that wealth often reveals character more than it builds it. Therefore, I have structured the inheritance of my remaining estate, valued at approximately $2.1 billion, in a manner designed to determine the true character of my beneficiaries. You could have heard a pin drop in that conference room. Each of my 3 children will receive an initial distribution of $10 million, to be used as they see fit. However, the remainder of their inheritance is contingent upon certain conditions being met over the next 12 months. Conditions? Marcus's face was red. What kind of conditions? For Marcus Sterling, you will receive your full inheritance of $400 million if you can successfully run a business, starting with only $100,000 of seed money, building it to profitability without using the Sterling name or your existing business connections. You must document this journey and the lessons learned. Additionally, you must remain married to your current fiancé for at least 2 years, demonstrating that you can commit to something beyond the wedding itself. Marcus looked like he might have a stroke. That's impossible. You can't build a successful business in a year with only $100K, not in this economy. Many people build businesses with far less, Maxwell noted. Your father did. For Olivia Sterling, Maxwell continued, you will receive your full inheritance of $400 million if you can work for 1 year at a position that pays no more than the median national salary, approximately $60,000 per year. You will maintain this employment without revealing your true family connections. You will live on only your salary during this time, with no access to your trust fund. At the end of the year, you will submit a reflection on what you learned about the lives of ordinary people. Olivia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I have to work a normal job? For normal people money? That's degrading. For James Sterling, and here Maxwell's voice softened slightly, You will receive your full inheritance of $400 million simply by continuing to live your life authentically and pursuing whatever brings you joy and fulfillment. Your inheritance has no conditions, as you are the only one of my children who never wanted my money in the first place. However, I hope you will use some of it to start the art therapy center you once told me about when you were 17, before I dismissed the idea as impractical." James sat frozen. Tears streaming down his face openly now, Richard felt his own eyes burning behind the colored contacts. He'd remembered. Somehow, in all his obsession with business and success, he'd retained that one conversation where James had shared his dream of creating a place where art could heal people. "This is bullshit," Marcus spat. "Complete bullshit. Father would never play games like this with his estate." "Oh, but he would," Victoria said quietly, her voice shaking with fury. "This is exactly the kind of controlling, manipulative thing Richard would do. Even in death, he has to orchestrate everyone's lives, has to prove he was smarter than everyone else, has to—" "For Victoria Sterling," Maxwell interrupted, his voice cutting through her tirade, "you will receive a one-time payment of $50 million and the use of the Sterling estate as previously mentioned. However, there is a caveat." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "What caveat?" "I am aware of your relationship with David Thornton. I have known about it for approximately 3 years." The color drained from Victoria's face. Around the table, shock registered on every face except James's. He was still staring at the table, processing his portion of the will. "While this betrayal hurt me deeply," Maxwell read, "I recognize that I drove you to it through years of emotional absence and workaholism. Therefore, I do not punish you for seeking companionship elsewhere. However, I want you to understand that the money I leave you is not a reward for 40 years of marriage. It is compensation for 40 years of loneliness. Use it wisely. Perhaps this time, choose someone who will actually be present." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "How dare he? How dare he? Even in death, Richard has to have the last word, has to make me feel small, has to—" Her voice broke. "I gave him 40 years. 40 years of my life. And this is what I get? A pittance and a lecture?" $50 million is hardly a pittance," Maxwell observed. "It is when his secretary gets a $6 million Monet." Victoria grabbed her purse. "You'll be hearing from my attorney. That prenup was signed under duress, and I'll prove it." She stormed out, her sister Catherine hurrying after her with an apologetic glance at the room. "Finally," Maxwell said into the stunned silence, "I come to Robert Sutherland." All eyes turned to Richard. "Robert," Maxwell read, "we met only once, 40 years ago at my father's funeral. You were a young man then, barely 25. And you said something that stuck with me. When I asked you what your plans were, you said you wanted to build a life full of people who loved you for who you were, not what you had. I dismissed this as naive at the time. I see now that you were wiser than me." Richard felt the room spinning slightly. He was quoting himself. He'd forgotten that conversation entirely, but it must have been stored somewhere in his memory, and his subconscious had pulled it out for this moment. "I leave you $100 million, Robert, with one condition, that you use it to teach my children what I failed to teach them. Teach them that success without love is failure. Teach them that wealth without purpose is poverty. Teach them that family is not a business, and love cannot be earned through achievement." The room was silent except for the sound of James crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. "And if they learn these lessons," Maxwell continued, "if they truly understand what I was too blind to see until it was too late, then at the end of 1 year, the remainder of my estate, approximately $1.3 billion, will be divided equally among the 3 of them. If they do not, that money will go to the Sterling Foundation for Arts and Humanities, ensuring that future generations will not be pressured to sacrifice their passions for practicality." Maxwell closed the portfolio. "That concludes the reading of the will. Any questions should be directed to me in writing. I'll be happy to clarify any provisions." "Good day." Marcus was the first to break the silence. "This is a joke. This entire thing is a fucking joke. Father spent his whole life building an empire, and now he's flushing it down the toilet to make some kind of point from beyond the grave? Maybe the point needed making, James said quietly. Oh, shut up, James. You got everything handed to you without having to do anything. No conditions, no hoops to jump through. Why? Because you were the failure? Because you never lived up to expectations? That's what gets rewarded? James stood slowly, meeting his brother's eyes. I didn't get everything handed to me, Marcus. I got acknowledged. There's a difference. And if you can't see that, then you've already failed Dad's test. He walked out, leaving Marcus sputtering. Olivia was still sitting, staring at nothing. $60,000 a year, she whispered. I spend more than that on handbags. Then perhaps it's time to reevaluate your priorities, Maxwell suggested gently. She looked up at him, and for a moment Richard saw something genuine in her face. Fear, maybe, or realization. I don't know how to be normal. I don't know how to be anything other than Richard Sterling's daughter, the trust fund baby, the influencer. What am I without all that? That, Maxwell said, is exactly what your father wanted you to discover. Olivia gathered her things slowly and left without another word. Marcus followed, already on his phone, presumably calling his lawyer. Soon only Richard, Maxwell, and Harold, Richard's brother, remained in the room. Harold had been silent throughout the entire reading. Now he stood and approached Richard. Robert Sutherland, that's a good name. Very proper, very... not Richard. Richard's heart stopped. I'm sorry? Harold smiled sadly. I've known my brother for 62 years, Richard. Did you really think some prosthetics and a wig would fool me? I recognized your posture the moment you walked in. You stand exactly like our father did. Harold, It's all right. Harold held up a hand. I'm not going to expose you. Frankly, I think this is the most interesting thing you've done in decades. The old Richard would have just divided up the money and called it done. This, he gestured around the room, this is actually trying to fix things. It's probably too late, but at least you're trying. Richard felt the disguise falling away, metaphorically, if not literally. Why didn't you say anything? Because the person who needs to reveal himself is you, not me. When are you planning on coming back from the dead? After the year, after they've either learned something or haven't. And if they learn nothing, if they fail your tests, then at least I'll have given them a chance to be better than I was. Harold studied him for a long moment. You know, Richard, the saddest part of all this is that you had to die to figure out how to live. I hope it's not too late for you. I really do. He patted Richard's shoulder and left. Maxwell began packing up his files. Well, that was exciting. I particularly enjoyed the part where Victoria threatened to sue. She won't, Richard said. The prenup is ironclad, and she knows it. She's angry. But she's not stupid. And Marcus? Marcus will try the challenge because his ego won't let him admit defeat. Whether he'll succeed or learn anything is another matter. Olivia? Olivia is the wild card. She might surprise us. And James? Richard smiled, the first genuine smile he'd had in weeks. James is going to be fine. He always was fine. I just didn't know how to see it. 1 year later, the clock in Maxwell Chen's office showed 2 RPM, exactly when Richard Sterling walked through the door. The prosthetics were gone. The disguise was abandoned. After a year of being dead, Richard Sterling was very much alive, and he'd asked his family to meet him at Maxwell's office for a special announcement regarding the estate. They'd all come, of course. The year was up, and the remainder of the inheritance hung in the balance. Maxwell showed Richard into the same conference room where the will had been read 12 months earlier. The cameras were set up again, but this time, Richard wouldn't be hiding. This time, he would face his family directly. The door opened and James entered first. He froze when he saw Richard, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and then, impossibly, joy. "Dad?" James whispered. "But how? I'm alive, James. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." James crossed the room in 3 strides and threw his arms around Richard, hugging him with a fierceness that nearly knocked Richard over. "You asshole!" James said, laughing and crying simultaneously. "You absolute asshole! I mourned you. I grieved. And you were alive the whole time?" I know, and I'll spend the rest of my actual life making it up to you, if you'll let me." Marcus and Olivia entered next, their reactions markedly different. Marcus went pale, then red, then pale again. "This isn't possible. We buried you. We saw the accident report, the DNA evidence." "All fabricated," Richard said calmly. "I staged my death to see how you would all react, to see who you really were when you thought I couldn't see." "You what?" Marcus's voice rose to a shout. "You put us through hell for a year to run some kind of sick experiment?" "Yes," Richard said simply. "I did, and what I saw at my funeral told me everything I needed to know." Olivia had said nothing. She simply sank into a chair, staring at Richard like he was a ghost. "You heard everything," she said finally. "At the funeral, the things we said, you heard all of it." "I did. Oh, God," she put her face in her hands. "I'm so ashamed." Victoria was the last to enter, and her reaction was the most controlled. She stopped in the doorway, assessed the situation with one sweep of her eyes, and said, Of course you faked your death, because the real thing would be too simple, too straightforward. Richard Sterling always needs to be 3 steps ahead of everyone else." "Hello, Victoria. How is David?" "We're engaged," she said defiantly. "Getting married in the spring. I assume you'll be contesting the divorce now that you're alive?" "Actually, I signed the papers 3 months ago. You're officially divorced. The decree should have arrived last week." That caught her off guard. "You signed them? Without trying to renegotiate terms?" "You deserve to be happy, Victoria, even if it's not with me, especially if it's not with me." For a moment, her composure cracked, and Richard saw something he hadn't seen in years. The woman he'd married 40 years ago, before disappointment and neglect had hardened her into someone else. "You should have fought for me," she said quietly. "Years ago, when it might have mattered. You should have fought." "You're right. I should have. I'm sorry I didn't." She nodded once, then took a seat at the table. "Well, since we're all here, I assume you have some kind of dramatic announcement about who won your little game?" Maxwell distributed folders to each person at the table. "Reports on the conditions of the will. As you know, each of you had 1 year to fulfill certain requirements. Let's review." Richard watched his children's faces as Maxwell went through each case. Marcus Sterling started an e-commerce business with $100,000 of seed money. The business achieved profitability in month 9, slightly ahead of projections. Revenue for the year, $847,000. Marcus completed the required documentation of his journey and submitted a 200-page analysis of his experience. Additionally, Marcus celebrated his first wedding anniversary last month and reports that the marriage is surprisingly stable. Marcus met Richard's eyes. "It was the hardest year of my life. Did you know how difficult it is to build something without being able to name-drop Sterling Industries, without being able to leverage our connections? I was nobody. Just another entrepreneur with a dream and a laptop." "And?" Richard prompted. "And it was humbling and educational, and I understand now why you started with nothing. It teaches you things that inheriting an empire never could." Marcus paused. "I'm still angry at you for putting me through this, but I'm also grateful." "Is that insane?" "Not insane," Richard said. "Human." Olivia Sterling, Maxwell continued, secured employment at a nonprofit organization called Haven House, a shelter for women and children fleeing domestic violence. Position, program coordinator. Salary, $58,000 per year. She maintained this employment for the full 12 months, living in a 700-square-foot apartment on her salary alone. She submitted a 50-page reflection on her experience. Olivia's eyes were red. "I met a woman there, Sarah. She had 2 kids and an abusive ex-husband who drained their bank accounts and destroyed her credit. She was staying in our shelter, trying to rebuild her life from nothing. She worked 3 jobs, just to save enough for a security deposit on an apartment." Olivia's voice broke. "And I realized that my problems weren't problems. I realized that I'd spent my entire life complaining about things that didn't matter while people like Sarah were fighting just to survive. I realized..." She looked at Richard. "I realized what an insufferable brat I'd been. And I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry. She started to cry, and Richard moved to hug her, but she held up a hand. No, I need to finish. I want you to know that I quit my influencer career, deleted all my social media accounts except for one Instagram I used to raise money for Haven House. I'm going back to school to get a social work degree. The me from a year ago would be horrified, but the me right now, I'm proud of who I'm becoming. Richard felt his throat tighten. I'm proud of you too, Olivia. Prouder than I've ever been. James Sterling, Maxwell said, and smiled. James spent the year traveling, creating art, and in month 6, he opened the Sterling Center for Art Therapy in downtown Seattle. The center offers free art therapy sessions to children and adults dealing with trauma, depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. It is fully funded by his inheritance and has already helped over 300 people. James submitted no formal reflection, but instead painted this. Maxwell turned on the screen behind him, displaying a photograph of a large canvas painting. It showed a man and a boy fishing at a lake, their lines cast into water that reflected a sunset. But in the reflection, you could also see them as they were now. 2 men, separated by years and mistakes, still holding their fishing rods, still hoping to catch something worth keeping. It's called What Remains, James said softly, because after everything else falls away, after the money and the anger and the disappointment, there's still this, the memory of a perfect day, the hope that we can find our way back to that feeling, even if we can't return to that moment. Richard couldn't speak. He simply nodded, hoping James understood the depth of his emotion. Victoria Sterling, Maxwell continued, satisfied all terms of the divorce settlement and has moved on with her life. Per the will, no additional conditions were placed on her inheritance beyond the initial settlement. Victoria inclined her head. For what it's worth, Richard, I hope you find what you're looking for, whatever this whole charade was about. I already found it, Richard said, looking at his children. I found it the day I attended my own funeral and realized what I'd lost, and I found it again today, seeing who you've all become. Maxwell cleared his throat. Which brings us to the final determination. Per the terms of Richard Sterling's will, the remainder of his estate, $1.3 billion, will be distributed if the heirs successfully completed their assigned tasks and demonstrated genuine growth and understanding. Based on the evidence presented, I am pleased to announce that all conditions have been met. Wait, Marcus said. James didn't have any conditions. How can he meet conditions that didn't exist? The condition was implicit, Richard said. James had to keep being James. Keep being authentic. Keep pursuing meaning over money. And he did. He always has. So we each get, Olivia did the math in her head, $433 million? Yes, Maxwell confirmed, to be distributed immediately. The room fell silent as everyone processed this. Then Marcus started laughing. It began as a chuckle and grew into full-bodied, almost hysterical laughter. This is insane. This whole situation is completely insane. It really is, Olivia agreed, and then she was laughing too. Even James cracked a smile. We're a very strange family. Yes, Richard said. We are. But maybe now we can be a family that's strange together, instead of strangers who happen to share DNA. Victoria stood. As touching as this is, I should go. David is waiting, and I have a wedding to plan. Richard, despite everything, I don't hate you. I just wish we'd been brave enough to end things decades ago. We might have both been happier. You're probably right, Richard acknowledged. Be happy, Victoria. You deserve it. After she left, Richard turned to his 3 children. I know I can't undo the past. I can't give you back the father you needed when you were growing up. But I'd like to try to be that father now, if you'll let me. Not Richard Sterling, the billionaire. Just Dad. Just Dad, James repeated, smiling. I think I'd like that. It's going to take time, Marcus warned. You don't just erase 40 years of dysfunction because of one grand gesture. I know. I'm not expecting instant forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance. Olivia stood and walked to Richard, studying his face. You look different, not just without the disguise. You look lighter. Like you've been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. That's exactly what it feels like, Richard admitted. She hugged him then, fierce and tight. Don't die again, okay? Once was enough. I promise. Marcus was the last holdout, sitting at the table with his arms crossed. I'm still angry at you. You know that, right? I'm angry that you didn't trust us enough to just talk to us, that you had to fake your death and spy on us like we were business competitors instead of your family. You have every right to be angry, Richard said, and if you need time before we can move forward, I understand. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to Richard, extending his hand. Time, but not forever. Deal? Richard shook his son's hand. Deal. 6 months later, Richard stood at the edge of the lake at the cabin, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. Behind him, he could hear laughter from the cabin, James telling some story that had Olivia in stitches, Marcus grumbling good-naturedly about the lack of cell service. They'd started having family dinners once a month. Nothing formal, nothing forced. Just the four of them, cooking together, eating together, actually talking. It was awkward sometimes. There were still old wounds that ached, but there was also healing. James came out onto the dock carrying 2 fishing rods. Thought you might want company. Always, Richard said. They cast their lines into the water, standing shoulder to shoulder in comfortable silence. After a while, James said, I've been thinking about the painting. What remains? Yeah? I was wrong about the title. It's not about what remains after everything else falls away. It's about what remains possible, even after you think you've lost everything. Even after you've made every mistake, there's always the possibility of this. He gestured at the lake, the sunset, the two of them together. This moment, this chance. Richard felt tears prick his eyes for what must have been the 1,000th time since his resurrection. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best, James said, once he stopped trying to teach me and started trying to listen. They fished until the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars emerged. They didn't catch anything, but that was fine. They weren't really fishing for fish anyway. Inside the cabin, Marcus and Olivia had started a fire. When Richard and James entered, Olivia was showing Marcus her latest project, a photo essay about the women and children at Haven House, their faces filled with hope and determination. This is really good, Liv, Marcus was saying. Have you thought about turning it into a book? I have some publishing contacts who might be interested. You'd do that, even though there's no profit in it? Marcus smiled. Turns out, not everything has to be about profit. Who knew? Richard settled into a chair by the fire, watching his children interact with an ease that had never existed before. They were finding their way to each other, slowly but surely. And maybe, just maybe, they were finding their way back to him. James sat on the floor, sketching something in his ever-present notebook. Olivia and Marcus continued discussing the photo essay, their conversation animated and genuine. This was what a family looked like, Richard realized. Not the staged perfection of their formal dinners in the mansion, not the performance they'd put on for society and cameras. Just 4 people who'd hurt each other and been hurt, trying to figure out how to love each other better. Hey, Dad, Olivia said suddenly. Next month, can we have dinner at my apartment? I want you all to see where I live. It's not fancy, but it's mine, and I'm proud of it. I'd love that, Richard said. And maybe, Marcus added, the month after, we could all go to the art center. James has been telling me about the work they're doing, and I'd like to see it. Really? James looked up, surprised and pleased. Really? I mean, someone in this family should know what you actually do all day, right? They all laughed. And in that moment, Richard felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope for the future. He'd died to learn how to live. He'd lost everything to discover what mattered. And while he couldn't change the past, he could shape what came next. Not as Richard Sterling, the titan of industry, the self-made billionaire, the man who'd conquered every challenge except the ones that mattered most. Just as Dad. Just as a man trying, finally, to get it right. Outside, the lake reflected the stars. Each point of light doubled and dancing on the water's surface. Inside, a family sat together by the fire, talking and laughing and slowly, carefully, learning to be whole. It wasn't the ending Richard had expected, but it was perhaps the one he'd needed all along.